questions for any of the speakers? Can I start it off, John? Again, thanks to Kieran and Trace and, of course, Pat for three excellent presentations. And now, just trying to bring I suppose, a thread through all three from what I've seen of it, bring it into sort of the modern day and modern day politics. And I mentioned it briefly when I addressed the question to Kieran earlier on. Therese dealt with women and the role of women perhaps in the struggle, both in the revolutionary period and indeed, maybe through the labour classes and so on. And we're now in 2021 and that type of struggle mostly seems to have been gone, the military side of things anyway. And the battleground seems to be in Dáil Éireann and Shannon Éireann and places like that. So in terms of Theresa's element, we constantly hear that women are underrepresented in politics. Women are underrepresented in the Dáil and probably underrepresented in all sorts of things like that. And yet we look at the Dáil perhaps as this place that runs the country and that everything that happens goes in or out of that place. And I'm just wondering what the panel's general view is of the Dáil playing that role, and is that the correct type of model that we should have in Ireland, or is there a vision of an alternative model? And then secondly, in terms of the women, I'd like to know, Therese, if you subscribe to that view that there should be more women parliamentarians, politicians and so on, or is that just another divisive type of thing that the real struggle is for ordinary people and workers and everybody else to sort of get a fair crack at the whip, irrespective of who's given them the opportunity, that it doesn't have to be exclusively men running things or exclusively women, but that once it's the right people doing it, wherever they come from, then we kind of get to not quite a Valhalla situation, but as good as we're going to get kind of a situation. Now, it's a long-winded way of putting it, but I'm trying to string the three elements between worker struggle, women's struggle, revolutionary struggle, and indeed just labour struggles all through history. We never, in my view, seem to progress very far. I could be wrong, that's just how it looks to me. I'm just thinking how you might think of that and how, we started this, I thought at the start, with almost women being written out of history. And hence the opening night was Theresa on women. I don't know if they've made any significant progress since. So it's wide enough, but there you go. There are microphones.
Can I just speak with the mic?
Yeah, please use it. Yeah.
Speak with the mic. Is it on? Or?
Mic's on.
Yeah. I think there should be more women, obviously, in any kind of situation, and the kind of the words that they put the motion in 1921. That it's a sign of the progress of society, and if women are given space and can be heard, and are visible, and if you look, that sentiment goes back to Charles Fourier in the 1830s. When they kind of invented socialism. He kind of just said that the sign of progress in a society is when there are women there, and James Connolly sort of endorsed the same idea with his writings about women. But I think if you just want to have women there, that's just the important bit, then just go and have, what do you call it, set numbers of women can be elected on a party ticket. I just think all the other ways, you just go round the mulberry bush, and the one thing that does work is if you have a set number of people being represented and going forward. It worked in the early 20th century when women came through the trade union movement, for that moment that we looked at on Friday. And I think I was just kind of thinking when Kieran was speaking about the revival, if you like, of the Women Workers' Union and the women-only union, which was always frowned upon very deeply, really, in the trade union movement, and the way it had developed was obviously quite often seen as a very conservative movement. Well, it was only as conservative as the people of the times that were in it, in a sense. It could have been a more radical organisation, but I kind of feel that the women that kind of decided that the women workers had to survive and went at all costs to do that, in a sense was partly because they wanted the legacy of James Connolly's ideas to be part of the revolution, and they had sort of struggled to bring that into Sinn Féin, you know, the League of Women Deputies, when they kind of had the organisation in 1917. And I think they saw the trade union movement as a place that could still hold that argument. I mean, if we remember 1917, Helena Maloney, Bridget Davis, Rosie Hackett went up Liberty Hall and put up the banner that said James Connolly executed, you know, and commemorated his first anniversary, because literally nobody else was doing anything about it. The trade union movement and nobody. So they barricaded themselves in, and the army tried to get them down, and they put coal against the door. It's a kind of extraordinary story, but so does that element, and somehow I think, I don't know why or what the circumstances are, but they had sussed that this was going to be, if you like, the first casualty of the revolution. Connolly's kind of ideas, if you like, the socialism was actually going to be written out. And I kind of still hark back to the thing that I mentioned on Friday night, the fact that Una Pope Hennessy, in her diary, sort of had noticed in 1917 that one of the most determined efforts that De Valera was making was to remove Connolly from the kind of sense of where Ireland's struggle would be heading. Don't know if that really addresses what you raised, but anyway.
It does, certainly, to a point anyway. It's like, but there's probably no end to it, really. It's like history, it's always evolving, I suppose.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
Yeah. Is this working okay?
Well, he said to you beforehand to use it, but it doesn't seem to be working.
Doesn't seem to be, does it?
Right, on that. I'd like to develop a little, a thing that Kieran so rightly emphasised. The lack of power of local authorities. Everything is centralised in Dublin. But I'd take it a bit further than you, Joe. I would say the Dáil is virtually powerless. It's a talking shop. A motion gets passed in the Dáil. It has no status, it has no standing. If the opposition in their private members' time pass a motion saying that the local authority or the local property tax should be doubled or whatever, that has no significance. The government are free to ignore it, to dismiss it as the mad ramblings of the opposition. Sure, what else would they do? So it has become even more centralised. It is purely in the hands of the executive and the cabinet. Incredible centralisation of power. So, kind of, if the Dáil didn't sit for the next 6 months, would anybody actually miss it in terms of the running of the country? It's an appalling thing to say that the primary democratically elected forum is treated at times with disdain by the cabinet and the government. And I don't know if you'd agree with that rant.
Well, sorry, is this working?
There don't seem to be any more.
Yeah, okay, look, yeah, I mean, you got to be a little bit careful, because obviously sometimes the alternative to Dáil might be bloody Mussolini arriving in, so we're not going that way, right? But just, it is important that people are aware of the limitations of the Dáil. So, I mean, I work with the people for profit deputies, and I go in there once a week, but I was shocked to discover, I didn't know this until 2 years ago, that if you're a member of the opposition and you put forward a bill that has any financial implications, it's just ruled out of order. And the point is that 46 bills in the last Dáil are ruled out of order because even if you get a majority for them, you can't even discuss them, because under the financial measure, an opposition is not allowed to put forward any proposal which is financial costs on the state. Now, that's bad enough, but they then extend that into all sorts of other areas where it's a bit vague. So you might say, for example, we want to ban fracking in Ireland. Is that a cost on the state or not? But they will use this measure to say that you can't put forward such a bill. So there is a problem in terms of the Dáil, right? There's also a problem in terms of people obviously telling you lies at election, then going in voting differently? Can you recall them? There's all sorts of. So I am for, if you like, extending the level of democracy in Ireland, and it's a long discussion. But I think we shouldn't assume that democracy is a finished product and now we have it all. We should look at other ways of extending it. Having said that, I think it's important that people have representation in the Dáil, because if nothing else, you're going to see this person on your 6 o'clock news articulating things that people feel on the ground. So it's very important to have people in the Dáil, whatever people's political views are. Just quickly on the question of women, I think that absolutely I agree with Theresa. First of all, there's complete underrepresentation of women in Irish politics to do with its history. But what we have is essentially an elite who have moved to what I would call to a skin-deep liberalism. So if you think of Leo Varadkar, he was originally against the marriage equality. He's spoken in the Dáil against marriage equality, and then he shifts. And so you have this shift amongst the elite. But what that means in practice is 40% of your candidates in the election have to be women. There is funding for women candidates. All of this is happening, right? But it doesn't address some fundamental issues affecting women's equality. So two in particular, we have the highest creche fees in Europe. You know, incredible. I mean, think of how much it costs to send a kid to a creche in Ireland. Or, I just saw it recently, remember Simon Harris said he was going to provide free contraception. He said that at 2000, and he's going to have to provide free contraception by 2021. Nothing happening. This week, France has just provided free contraception for 25 million for a population that is, 10 times the size of Ireland, but yet we can't do it in Ireland. In other words, they do a lot of tokenism and minor detail. They don't address fundamental issues of equality, I don't think.
I would certainly agree with the idea that there's an awful lot of tokenism. And the classic example is the cúpla focal. What they'll pay a token thing to the Irish language, but don't do anything that might be real. And that classic tokenism was always the politician starting off with a cúpla focal os Gaeilge, and then he'd say, now for the benefit of those in present who are not fluent in our national language, I will continue in English. You know, pure tokenism. Was that, sorry?
Yeah, it was just with regard to the issue of the sort of democratic deficit. I think sometime in the 1920s, the Department of Local Government suggested to the government that they should abolish all local authorities. Shouldn't have any of them at all. They were unnecessary. And then in 1929, they established the city managers, the city manager of Cork, 1929. And the city manager, county manager, is surely unique. I've often wondered, like governors in the US or mayors in the US, I think they've got less power than a city manager. The city manager is effectively the corporate chief executive of the local area. The councils, good luck to them, and it's a great forum and so forth, but the city manager is controls Ireland.
Well,
just to give an example, just a Dublin example, just to really illustrate this. When I get up in the morning, I look out at the sky and there's an incinerator spewing out smoke for 24 hours a day. I think 42 of the 45 councillors voted against having an incinerator. The city manager decided he wants one. That's why he had an incinerator. So they have enormous powers. And not just the mayor. In America, the mayor is elected. This is an unelected person who can override elected representatives. I mean, it's extraordinary, the clamp on democracy, local democracy here.
See, what central government did in various things, when they recognised that something might be controversial, you give the power to the city manager, which is why the city manager in Dublin, I think something like 5 or 6 times, the vast majority of the Dublin City Councils voted against the incinerator. And no, city manager decided to go ahead. The same way, and as I said, living in Settlemount, I'm very conscious of it, the recent thing about the cycling proposal. And You know, let's put it this way. The Strand Road in Sandymount, and I live very near it, has over the years become a perfect bypass. It has bypasses Sandymount village, and it has helped to preserve the village nature of Sandymount, which is fantastic. But now, Owen Keegan says, to facilitate the cyclists, and I'm all for providing, but he picked one option. There are plenty of other better options in my view, and he said, well, the diverted traffic can go in through the village. He decides that. Councillors are against it. Doesn't matter. He decides. It's a total, as you said perfectly, the democratic deficit. And it's there by giving this power to the unelected. Yeah.
I was not aware of that until this very moment, that is how it runs here, that the city manager has that much control. I can't believe that, and why aren't we doing something immediately to change that? That's shocking.
John?
But I think that, yeah. All right, Tom, go ahead.
In the absence of organised labour's contribution to the struggle during that period, would the outcome have been the same in terms of British withdrawal in the 2670s?
I think you're correct. I think that the involvement of the labour movement was quite decisive in terms of the anti-conscription strike, the inability to move munitions, and the general mass, if you like, boycott of the RIC stations. I think if it had been a purely IRA struggle, they mightn't have even got rid of the British, or ended up with even less than they got at the moment. So in that aspect, I mean, obviously certain things were gained in terms of the War of Independence, but often the credit is not given to Labour for playing its role in that.
I'm certain the mics are working. I think they are. I'll ask you to use them if you could, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're, just so everybody knows, we're recording this for posterity, and the mics are helping to get it onto the soundtrack to back up the pictures that we're filming. So in 50 years' time, when somebody looks back on this, I want them to hear what your answers are. So,
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
If the Labour movement had played a more prominent role, if they had allied themselves, we say, Sinn Féin, and had agreed a certain degree of representation, would we have had possibly a slightly different treaty delegation? Look at the treaty delegation. You know, I don't think any of them, you know, could in any way be described as anything approaching socialist, even with the smallest S that you could find. You know, ranging from Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, Eamon Duggan, Gavin Duffy, Robert Barton. It was an incredibly conservative delegation, focused on one thing only, the constitutional relationship between Ireland and Britain. You know, I think that Labour missed an opportunity in not pushing their involvement further in the revolution. But that's just, say, a personal opinion.
I also kind of feel that one of the problems that Labour faced was the, if you like, its kind of emergence as something that came out of both the South and the North, to use sort of a very unwieldy phrases of the geography of the country and the politics of the country. That the trade union movement saw itself very much in terms of its All Ireland. Today it's still quite proud that only the Irish Rugby and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions are the two sort of All Ireland bodies that have survived the whole of the partition and the evolution of the separation. And it spent quite a lot of time, I think, looking over its shoulder. I mean, to some extent, by 1914, I mean, a lot of kind of the Belfast unions had decided to sort of, pick up their skirts and not bother coming back. But there was always that possibility that they would, and what Congress would have wanted that to happen. And I think that was something that probably I'm not saying paralysed them, but certainly kind of weakened probably a lot of their thinking at the time, or, you know, not weakened their thinking, but weakened their resolve as to coming down on one way or the other. I think also Sinn Féin had shown itself very resistant to having any other kind of powerful sort of movement, kind of making any concessions really to Labour, or to, you know, certainly I think they saw both Labour and women as potential difficult areas, and were fairly determined to keep them out of the scene.
Johnny. Go on, Johnny.
Yeah, my question is essentially, what is to be done? I mean, there was wonderful talks this weekend, and the heroism of ordinary people, you know, in terms of trying to change Ireland, has been kind of highlighted brilliantly. Women, workers, and all this, and the mass movements of people. But the parliament that we got hasn't changed the class nature or structure of society on the basis, you know, and the limited powers even that our elected representatives have. It looks to me as if real power doesn't lie in Parliament at all. It lies in the borders of the big companies, and the politicians and the main parties represent their class interests. And given that, you know, you look at the housing crisis, you look at the health crisis, you look at the climatic change, all this sort of stuff, you look at these vulture funds taking over in terms of house building and renting and all this, all the problems that we face. And one of the speakers from the floor mentioned the role of Sinn Féin. It seems to me that if you look at what Sinn Féin are doing when they're in power in the north, they're not going to really make profound and fundamental changes, it seems to me, because they're not challenging the class nature of the type of society that obviously exists. So what do people do, and especially given the role of the leadership of the official leadership of the Labour movement? I'm talking about Congress and what used to be the Labour Party. So what is to be done essentially is the question.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a famous title, but what do I think? What should Labour movements be doing in the next short, rather than thinking long term? I mean, first of all, the housing crisis. I mean, it is quite shocking. I'm sure it's the same in Waterford as other parts of the country, but the document housing fraud is not going to solve the housing crisis. Rents are going to remain very high. I think most young people will either think of emigrating or staying in their parents' house in their late 20s because they won't be able to afford the rent. So we have a huge housing crisis here. So I think it's a major issue that people should be mobilising on, just as we mobilise on the water charges. The problem again is there was supposed to be a major march on the 2nd of October under Raise the Roof. The Irish Congress Trade Unions has just pulled out of it. So I don't know how we're going to get a focus on it, but it seems to me that is a major issue in our society. And the other one I just want to highlight is the climate. There will be obviously people's attention is focusing on what's happening on climate at the moment because of all the scenes on our television. There will be a COP conference in Glasgow in November that will really bring it to attention. And I think that often, I mean, what worries me is that people will associate the climate movement with the Green Party and think it's about making ordinary people sacrifice, paying more for your petrol and this, that and the other. And I just think the Labour movement needs to develop a genuine just transition approach, which is about not penalising people, but making it easier to for example, get out of cars. I mean, we have the worst public transport system in Europe. Dublin has the dearest fares in Europe. I have to use Dublin examples. So if you had a decent public transport system and you're guaranteed you can get on a bus and it's going to take you to your workplace, of course people would get out of cars. But the approach is just blame the individual. So I think we need to develop a different agenda on climate, particularly with the Greens in power. That's what I would see as some of the tasks at the moment.
Well, I think that to dwell on the housing crisis for a moment, just think for, and this is simplistic, there's no harm being simplistic occasionally. In the 1930s and again in the 1950s, Ireland was a very poor country, and we built some of the best housing public housing. Now we're among the richest countries in the world and we can't build houses.
Yeah.
And until the state actually takes ownership and says, we, the state, will deliver, we will use the local authorities, and we will build. But instead of this semi-liberal, skin-deep liberalism, the private sector, etc., 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 until they grasp it. But I have to say, Kieran, I thought, when you were talking about the counter-reaction, that wonderful phrase, the triumph of the Clongowes Wood boys, on that. And
They're still there.
yeah,
Still there.
now, I was brought up at a time when we thought that the Irish Rebellion, as it was called at the time, then the Irish Revolution, was the product of the Christian Brother boys. And being one myself, I said, great. Now I see, geez, we were beaten by Clongowes Wood. And I think that actually sums up a lot, the entrenched power. And if you actually look not at the current government, but go back to the previous government, I think for about the first time ever, a majority of the cabinet had been educated in private schools.
Correct. Yeah.
You know, that's the triumph of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the Irish politicians originally had a sort of usually man of the people style stuff. You know, they went to the same schools, supported the same GA. What's beginning to emerge is a bit like the British pattern, where if you look at a Tory cabinet, I mean, more than half of them have gone to a private school.
Yeah.
That is beginning to emerge in Ireland now. So you're absolutely right. The last cabinet was the first one that had a majority of ministers that went to a private school. I haven't checked out this one, but I'm sure it's going that way as well.
I'm not going to defer from either of the speakers on what is to be done question. I mean, it seems to me that that's the issues that would be mentioned are the vital ones, but it's the both of the issues of we can see that we've governments that are not really prepared to sort of act on it. You know, we can keep separating our rubbish till the fires take over or the floods come. I mean, it's you know, you just need something much stronger, and maybe we don't demand enough from our governments, but I think we do have to think about different ways of doing things, and in terms of how we kind of mobilise. You know, we do tend to fall back on the 19th century kind of movements of marching or protesting in that way. And I think, you know, some of the kind of community developments, I think the Labour movement should be much more kind of tied with its communities. I know it sounds a ridiculous thing to say to a Trades Council meeting, at a meeting of people sponsored by the Trades Council, because obviously the essence of a Trades Council is that it is that. But I don't think there's really enough on a sort of general issue. It's probably very strong in certain places, but it's not strong as a sort of national movement, and that seems to me that we need to kind of reconsider some of these kind of ways of operating. And I mean, everybody knows, just even on the technology, the changeover to you know, people being in touch with each other in new ways rather than me waiting on the letter. You know, there's a ping goes up on a machine somewhere in the room, and you know, that kind of sense. It's kind of having to rethink, and sometimes we have to rethink by going backwards and looking backwards and seeing kind of actually how did they do things. You know, certain forms may have carried on, but actually sometimes what they did in the past were things that we can learn today. And the thing that always sticks in my mind is when women looked for reserved seats on the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and people were outraged. I mean, many trade unionists were furious and said that this had absolutely nothing to do with trade union democracy and would be, you know, a complete sort of deviation. And then when I go and look at the kind of history of trade unions, we discover the IMTO did it in 1907. You know, it's that kind of, you know, the battle that it took for kind of, you know, over a decade and a bit to try and sort of get representation for women in the movement. was could have almost been shortchanged if we knew our history better.
I just discovered, was it the number of councillors in Waterford? 30?
32.
There's 32 councillors in Waterford, and as far as I could be wrong, it's 2 or 3 are women.
Sorry?
There's 2 or 3 out of 32 in Waterford today that are women.
Right.
So clearly there's a really serious problem today.
I mean, people have often said things like, why women need trade unions, and sometimes we need to say why trade unions need women. Just kind of try and turn it upside down and look at it another angle.
But I know we're coming towards the end, but you're just saying the same thing, Therese, about why trade unions need women. If you go all the way back to the start of the talks and even through the labour history, whatever roles women take, they seem to be pushed to the back. You know, you mentioned Rosie Hackett, we know about Countess Markovich, you mentioned her as well, but there's not too many standout women when you think about it. There had to be loads of them, there had to be, but they're just brushed out.
I've been very lucky.
Or else I'm just misreading this whole thing.
I've just learned that the Miss McCarthy I know nothing about, I now have met kind of one of her relations, and I can kind of pick her up and go on a bit more forward with those stories. Because these are, I mean, I do think that people do need to be sort of rescued from the sort of, not even the footnotes, but from the silences and the absences and the sort of, because in the end, those are vacuums, there's no air in that space if you don't kind of really fill it with some of the kind of peoples and struggles of
If we're all done, I'd like to thank our 3 speakers. It's been very interesting, informative and enlightening at times, and I think there's much to reflect on. So I'd like to say thanks to Therese, to Pat and to Kieran, and thanks to you all for coming down as well and supporting the event. Thanks.
Thank you.